Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Larkin, and I'm the chair of the history department here at St. John's St. Ben's. I'd like to welcome all of you and thank you for attending tonight's Tegeder-Berg Society event, Marriage Equality in Minnesota in Personal and Historical Perspective. For those of you unfamiliar with the Tegeder-Berg Society, it's an association of history alums, students, and faculty from St. John's St. Ben's. We hold one public event each semester, and we hope to return to in-person events next spring so that our students and alums can interact with each other face to face. For those of you who don't know about the Tegeder-Berg Society, we highlight the importance of studying the past because we believe that only by studying the past can we gain a full understanding of the present. Therefore, history students are particularly prepared to lead because having studied how the present came to be, they can imagine better possible futures and devise strategies to achieve them. Of course, by studying the past, history students also develop the analytical skills and habits of mind that prepare them for meaningful careers and engaged citizenship. At every Tegeder-Berg Society event, a history alum provides a testimonial of how studying history has helped shape their career and life paths. And tonight's alum speaker is Ashley Bukowski. Ashley is a 2015 grad from St. Ben's, and she received degrees both in history and economics. After graduation, she went on to the University of North Dakota, where she received her Juris Doctorate. And she is now employed at the law offices of Kelm and Reuter in Sauk Rapids, Minnesota, where she practices in general litigation. Outside of work, Ashley enjoys spending time with her husband, Mike, who is also a St. John's alum, 2016, and spending time at Johnny and Benny athletic games and staying active in her community through her Rotary and Lions clubs. So I'd like everyone to welcome Ashley Bukowski.
Thank you, Professor Larkin, and hello, everyone. As Professor Larkin said, my name is Ashley Bukowski, and I'm a 2015 graduate of the College of St. Benedict, where I received dual degrees in economics and history. After graduating, I went on to obtain my law degree and now practice as a litigating attorney in the St. Cloud area at the law offices of Kelm and Reuter. Now, it is often a common path to obtain a history degree, then go on to law school. Of course, a history degree can teach you valuable skills like thinking critically, analyzing specific documents, and enhancing your writing. All these are valuable traits that I obtained at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. But I thought if I just touched on these traits, I'd be doing my professors a disservice. Because what the history department really taught me was to see history in a different light. Specifically, I learned that history is not memorizing various dates that happened in the past, but really thinking critically about how an event or an occasion is perceived by one individual or society. Ironically, today is a perfect example of this, as the day is often referred to as Columbus Day. I grew up learning about Christopher Columbus, thinking this day was a celebration of advancement of discovery and achievement. We now know that there is much more to Christopher Columbus's story. The indigenous people that were oppressed and taken advantage of would not look at Christopher Columbus as an individual to be celebrated. Now, this example may seem like something that can just be learned by watching a news program, but by obtaining my history degree, I learned to take it a step further. To fully understand the reasoning behind celebrating an individual like Christopher Columbus, a history major would learn through their coursework to first ask, why is it important that this individual is celebrated? Why were they picked to be celebrated in the first place? And why was a national holiday created for them? What message was sent when this national holiday was created? And how do people perceive this holiday? Maybe most importantly, it's how does this holiday affect different groups? Now, these questions can be applied to various events, but I have learned through studying history that historic events are recorded and celebrated by certain individuals that present a story that may not encompass all the factors that need to be considered. That specific lesson I learned now plays a major role in my career as a litigator. As a litigator, individuals often come to me and ask me to go to court to tell their story of an event, relationship, or transaction that occurred in the past. Of course, it is my job as their attorney to represent their best interests, which means informing my clients of realistic outcomes. Now, unfortunately, if I just listened to my clients and took what they said as the absolute truth, I would not be very successful in court. The same questions I just posed in my Christopher Columbus example often need to be posed when preparing for litigation. When my client is telling me the details and the timeline of their case, I need to be thinking about, why is this a case important to this individual? And what message is this individual trying to send? What will the potential opposing party do when litigation commences? And how will they perceive the details of the lawsuit? And again, most importantly, I have to ask, how will this litigation affect both my client, both now and in the future? This is what my history degree has taught me: to recognize biases, think beyond the individual telling the story, and so how even what is perceived as a minor event can have a major effect on certain groups. Without my history degree, I would not be able to perform my job. I want to thank Professor Larkin and the entire history department staff for giving me this opportunity tonight and for allowing me to be a successful history major. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ashley, for sharing how history has shaped your life and your career after graduation. Now, just for a word on format, we will begin tonight's event with a brief introduction about the larger context of gay rights and the movement for marriage equality provided by Professor Shannon Smith. Afterwards, Professor Jonathan Nash will interview our guest, Tom Trisko. Please feel free at any time to submit questions via the Q&A button during the presentation and interview. I'd just like to briefly introduce Dr. Shannon Smith, who is a professor of U.S. history. She teaches classes on 19th century U.S. history, as well as classes on gender and race in U.S. history.
Thank you, Dr. Larkin. I'm happy to be here with everybody tonight and enjoy sharing this larger historical context with you this evening. On October 10th, 1987, nearly 2,000 same-sex couples exchanged wedding vows on the steps of the Internal Revenue Service in Washington, D.C. This mass wedding was part of the 1987 March on Washington for Gay and Lesbian Rights. Wedding participants chose their location at the IRS to protest their inability to file joint tax returns and the additional tax burden this placed on same-sex couples. While a wedding seemed like the most conventional of social events, for gay and lesbian couples, it was a radical act of protest. Wedding historian Karen Dunnick has argued that the couple's demands of full acceptance of their relationship choices was a political act, acknowledging that protection of their personal relationships required political recognition. As one minister proclaimed, gay and lesbian couples must move out of the closets and into the chapels. Tom Trisko and John Rittman participated in the 1987 march with the Minnesota delegation and were thrilled to see the great numbers of participants. But their quest for marriage equality had not yet moved into the courts or the chapels. Our goal tonight is to situate the fight for marriage equality in historical context and hear Tom's stories of his personal and political experiences. Public support for gay marriage has grown considerably over the past 25 years, increasing from a 27% approval rate in 1996 to 67% in 2020. Not all LGBTQ+ activists agreed on how to achieve marriage equality, or even if marriage should be a top priority. Social movements require a variety of legal, political, social, and grassroots approaches. So tonight we will seek to understand some of that complexity, the challenges, and the victories. Many Americans trace the beginning of the gay rights movement to the uprising at the Stonewall Inn in June of 1969, when trans and gay patrons refused to be arrested and fought with the police over several nights. The Stonewall Rebellion was celebrated 1 year later with a march to Central Park that is known as the first Gay Pride Parade, a tradition now more than 50 years old. But the history of LGBTQ activism runs much deeper, from gay nightclubs in Harlem in the 1920s to other uprisings against police harassment in 1959 at Cooper's Donuts in Los Angeles, and in 1966 at San Francisco's Compton's Cafeteria. Many gay and lesbian people found each other and created communities as they moved away from their small towns to serve in World War II. Those connections were threatened, however, by the government crackdown during the McCarthy era, when more gay people than communists lost their jobs. The so-called Lavender Scare of the 1950s forced thousands of people out of employment in federal and state governments, schools and hospitals, and caused humiliation for many. This open discrimination against gay people was a result of new laws in the 20th century classifying and criminalizing people by sexual identity. The historian George Chauncey argues that such discrimination was neither natural nor inevitable, since many previous societies, including in the US, saw gay life as one more way of rebelling against restrictive traditions. By the 1960s and 70s, LGBTQ activists took inspiration from the civil rights movement, women's liberation, and other social movements of the time to organize and assert their pride. Coming out of the closet was a risky proposition for many, given the severe consequences of arrest, physical attacks, and financial ruin. The activist and politician Harvey Milk urged people to come out to their families and friends to increase visibility and gain support for civil rights. Milk understood that hatred and discrimination came from fear, and people would be less afraid if they realized that they knew gay people in their families, their churches, and their neighborhoods. If they know us, they can't hate us, Milk argued. But same-sex couples also noted the ways that their lack of marriage rights affected their place in society. Gay activists debated if they should work within mainstream society and adhere to accepted social and political institutions, a so-called assimilationist approach, or try to radically change society as a whole. Some rejected everything associated with traditional gender roles and marriage, while others demanded the right to do everything heterosexual couples could do. In 1970, Minnesota couple Mike McConnell and Jack Baker applied for a marriage license from the Hennepin County clerk, who rejected their application. The Minnesota State Supreme Court upheld that ruling in 1971. Baker argued that, quote, "Our getting married would be a political act with political implications. The institution of marriage has been used by the legal system as a distribution mechanism for many rights and privileges, which can be obtained only through a legal marriage. The couple hoped that the state and society would recognize that their love was, in their words, as valid and deep as any heterosexual love." But the movement for civil rights faced a powerful reaction. When Miami-Dade County passed a law in 1977 that prohibited discrimination in employment, housing, and public services, these advances in civil rights were met by Anita Bryant's Save Our Children crusade. Bryant, a singer, former Miss America, and spokesperson for Florida Orange Juice, spread the hateful rhetoric that gay people were, quote, "trying to recruit our children into homosexuality." The Miami ordinance was overturned by voters within 6 months, and anti-gay opponents in St. Paul used similar tactics to overturn a non-discrimination ordinance. But Minnesotans also supported openly gay politicians Alan Speer and Karen Clark in the 1970s and 80s. The call for legalized marriage became more pressing in the 1980s and 90s as more lesbian couples had children, prompting custody battles, and the scourge of AIDS decimated the gay community. Groups such as the Minnesota AIDS Project distributed meals and cared for each other. These circumstances caused more people to confront the question of who counted as family and what rights they had. Marriage conferred an immense range of government-sanctioned rights, protections, benefits, and obligations in both public and private life that were not available to everyone. Exclusion from marital rights imposed significant economic and legal consequences and prompted more LGBT couples to advocate for legal security for their relationships. Even if friends and family recognized and respected personal relationships, the powerful institutions of hospitals, funeral homes, and the state did not. These circumstances provoked questions about who could visit in hospitals and make medical decisions, estate planning, control of property, adoption procedures, and the ability of biological families to contest wills. Even those who could afford or had the time to create as many legal protections as possible could not cover everything, and legal documents could be contested. These problems were magnified as people tried to cope with the devastating illness of AIDS. The courts and the public became more aware of the legal consequences, that anything less than marriage was seen as less significant. While AIDS forced more people to come out and face possible disowning by their families, more straight people began to recognize the needs of gay people and share empathy. These issues came home to Minnesota when Sharon Kowalski of St. Cloud was paralyzed and unable to speak following a car accident in 1983. Kowalski's father won guardianship in 1985. Her partner, Karen Thompson, a professor at St. Cloud State, fought in court for the right to care for Sharon until she received guardianship in 1991. In the 1990s and early 2000s, there were signs that marriage equality might be an actual possibility. Court cases and legislative action created a series of victories and disappointments for gay activists. With Alan Speer as president of the Minnesota State Senate and Karen Clark pushing for inclusion of transgender rights, Minnesota passed a 1993 amendment prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in employment, housing, education, or other public services. Nationally, some companies and state and local governments began to recognize domestic partnerships and eventually civil unions for health insurance coverage, but many legal and economic challenges remained. The patchwork nature of legal rights from state to state caused frustration, as couples' relationships might be recognized in some states, but not in others. Mary Bonato of the Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders, or GLAAD, argued that, quote, when you actually puzzle it through and you see the number of rights associated with marriage that are otherwise categorically denied, when you see the number of people who say they want to choose this, when you see that marriage has become a gender-neutral institution and an institution of legal equality, some of these critiques don't seem too compelling anymore. Bonato pursued lawsuits in Massachusetts that led to it becoming the first state to issue same-sex marriage licenses in 2004. This victory, along with the 2003 Supreme Court case, Lawrence v. Texas, that extended the right to privacy to the bedroom, deepened the backlash against LGBTQ civil rights. Meanwhile, the US Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996, specifying that only heterosexual couples could receive federal marriage benefits, including filing joint tax returns, sponsoring spouses for immigration benefits, or receiving Social Security payments, and other legal benefits. Many states followed suit, and by the mid-2000s, 31 states added amendments defining marriage as between a man and a woman. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, public opinion on the subject of marriage equality was shifting drastically. 5 states had legalized same-sex marriages by the end of the decade. A flurry of lawsuits argued that the Defense of Marriage Act violated the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. In 2012, Minnesota voters defeated a proposed amendment defining marriage as between a man and a woman. And in 2013, the Minnesota legislature legalized same-sex marriage. The ultimate victory came in the 2015 Supreme Court case, Obergefell v. Hodges, which overturned all state bans on same-sex marriage and legalized gay marriage throughout the country. The US then joined more than 20 other countries that recognize gay marriages. These court rulings challenged the idea that gay, lesbian, bisexual, and queer people were less deserving of the same rights and protections as all other citizens, or that their personal relationships were not just as valuable as those of straight couples. In Reagan appointee Justice Anthony Kennedy's majority opinion, he wrote, "No union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a marital union, two people become something greater than once they were." As some of the petitioners in these cases demonstrate, marriage embodies a love that may endure even past death. It would misunderstand these men and women to say they disrespect the idea of marriage. Their plea is that they do respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. Their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right. Thank you. And I will turn it back over to Brian.
Thank you, Shannon, for providing that context. What a wonderful, wonderful introduction. Now we'll move on to the interview with Dr. Jonathan Nash and Tom Trisko. Dr. Jonathan Nash teaches courses on colonial and early Republican U.S. history, as well as classes on slavery and the Atlantic world. And because Tom's going to tell us a lot of his story tonight, I'm not going to say much about him right now, other than that he is a 1967 SJU alum with a degree in economics. He also earned an MA in political science at the University of Minnesota. And in 2008, he and his husband, John, sued the state of Minnesota for the right to marry. And I will let Tom tell you the rest of his story. With no further ado, we'll move on to our interview.
Thank you, Brian. Yes. Tom, welcome. It's so good to see you. Thank you so much for being with here tonight to share your knowledge and experiences with us. So how are you doing?
It's great. The lighting, I don't think, is as good as it could be, but then this isn't a TV studio.
Well, we'll do the best we can, where I can see you perfectly. Tom, would you be able to just tell us a little bit about your background, and maybe why you decided to attend St. John's and what life was like on campus when you were a student?
Sure. I'd like to preface my remarks, though, by saying that was a great presentation by Professor Smith, and I thought the slides were great, too. I'd like to know where she found them. The time that she discussed back in the 50s was very scary. I was born in Minneapolis and grew up in Hopkins and St. Cloud and went to Cathedral High there, and of course St. John's. But as I was growing up, it was in my mind that the two worst things you could possibly be in the world were to be a communist or to be gay, because in the early 50s, that was pretty much all you heard. And there was a small group of people that were the prime movers of the movement against gays and lesbians at the time, and that was made up of Cardinal Spellman of New York and J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, and Senator Joseph McCarthy and his assistant Roy Cohen, who was an attorney in New York. The four of them were all gay, and Cohen died of AIDS, not admitting it. But they carried on a campaign, and the General Society accepted it, and things were really bad. People were sent to mental hospitals and given lobotomies and shock treatments, and were labeled as either sick by the psychologists or a sinner by the churches, or as criminals by the state. So it was a heavy burden to bear when you were growing up, and it was beginning to dawn on you that you were different. Every gay person I've known always had an inkling, even when they were toddlers, that there was something that was different about them. And that was true of me also. But having said that, for me, that was all pushed in.
Tom, I think we lost your audio there for a second. Oh,
Can you hear now?
I hear you now, Tom.
Good. I don't know what happened, but anyway.
You're back.
As I was saying, times were tough, and I put that all aside and concentrated on my life. And I chose St. John's over St. Thomas, mostly because my mother thought that St. Thomas was too high class for our family. And but it turned out to be the best thing, because having been an only child, it was a totally new experience and wonderful for me to have all these brothers that I suddenly had on campus at St. John's. So I really enjoyed my 4 years there, and went from there to Georgetown on a fellowship, but that was interfered with by the draft. The draft board was on my case, and it ended up that they didn't draft me, but it was too late at that time to go back to Georgetown. So I spent a year working at St. John's for Dr. Ed Henry, who had a grant from the Ford Foundation for what they called the Micro City Project. And so I worked for him for a year, and then I went back to graduate school at the U. And in the process, I decided that I wanted to work in the world, and so I applied for a job, and I was hired by Dayton Hudson Corporation as their corporate economist, and worked there for several years, and went on to Medtronic, where I was their corporate economist and director of government affairs, and pretty much was, pursuing a regular career. But the whole gay movement was coming along, and at the U, I had taken a course from a sociology professor called People, Power, Change, and he also had a book on that. And of course, all these things that were going on in the world during the 60s and 70s, including the marriage effort, were influencing me in the background. And then I met John, of course, on December 21st of 1973, just by accident. He was going out, it was his birthday, and he was going out to a movie, and I was just coming home from work at Dayton Hudson. And we happened to have our parking spaces next to each other in the garage by accident, and that's how we met. And I decided that he was good looking and an interesting person. At that time, I didn't know anything else about him. And he lived just down the hall from me. as it turned out, he was an Air Force officer and had been recently sent to Minnesota to teach Air Force ROTC at the U. And I, of course, had been picketing occasionally outside the armory where he worked as an opponent of the Vietnam War. So we were kind of at the opposite ends of the spectrum, but that never turned out to be a problem. And so anyway, I decided that I was going to pursue him, and I did. And about a year later, I bought a condominium, and he moved in with me. And he was still in the Air Force, but he left the Air Force about a year later. And we've been together ever since. So our 50th anniversary is coming up.
Congratulations on 50 years. Thank you so much, Tom. And I'm also thinking about the wonderful context that Professor Smith provided us about the 1960s and 1970s. Would you talk a little bit in more depth and detail about some of the most important developments and events to you at the time? What really stood out for you? And what did they mean?
Of course, the various, the Black Civil Rights Movement, of course, in the 60s, and followed by the feminist movement. It just told you that and of course the anti-war movement, it just told you that you could bring about a change if you wanted to. At that time, the society was run by the members of my parents' generation, the John F. Kennedy generation that had fought in World War II. My dad had been in the Navy in World War II in the Pacific. And so they were running things. And in fact, they had just pretty much taken over in the early 60s. And when Kennedy was assassinated, that, of course, was a big shock to all of us. At St. John's, we had just finished having lunch and were kind of hanging around in the dorm. And we always had our doors open in the dorm those days, and it was a very social place. And people down the hall had the radio on, and that's how we heard about the assassination. And so they canceled classes after that Friday, and we all went home for the Thanksgiving period and pretty much lived watching the funeral procedures on television. So it made you realize that you were witnessing at that time a big historical event. It was no longer something in a book, that it was real, and it was things that happened. And I have to tell you that at my age now, you realize that you have lived through a lot of history, and that a lot of the things that were just things that happened that you participated in are now considered by historians like you to be important in history. So I'm very grateful for you having invited me on to talk about some of these things. It's given me a chance to inventory my life and see how much history I've lived through.
Well, that's why I'm so happy that you're here with us, because you're like the primary source that us historians are always happy to engage with. I guess I was curious, in 1970, 1971, Shannon mentioned Jack Baker and Mike McConnell. Were you at the time following what was occurring with them?
Yes, I was on campus at the U at the same time that they were, and I was very aware of what they were doing, and was aware that they held the first gay dance on campus, which was a kind of revolutionary thing to do those days. And I had heard that Mike McConnell had been fired by the Board of Regents after their marriage application from his job at the Wilson Library. So I had firsthand, what should I say? Maybe it wasn't firsthand, but it was very close experience and knowledge of what happens to gay people. And by that time, I was pretty sure I was one of them.
Yeah, and particularly too, I was curious, like towards the end of the 1970s, Professor Smith also mentioned Anita Bryant, and I know she made her way to Minnesota, and then when she was telling the world why she was there, she was able to taste some pie right in her face. So I wondered what you made of that at the time when she was pied.
Well, she and Bishop Roach both got pies in their face at various times from various people. That was a very, what should I say, memorable time for me and for John. We were living at my condo in Little Canada, and for the first time, we made picket signs, and we got in the car and drove to this orange juice and fresh orange warehouse just south of East Hempton Avenue, Minneapolis. And it was a beautiful, I think it was a summer day, it might have been fall, but it was a beautiful day like we've been having lately. And John and I were really kind of on a high driving down to this picketing scene. And on the other hand, it was one of the first times that we had done anything in public where we were going to be seen. I had been at the first Pride picnic in Loring Park I think it was 1970. And at that time, we were all hiding behind the trees in Loring Park, hoping that we wouldn't be on the news that night and our parents wouldn't see us. So going to the orange juice picket was kind of a coming out thing. There was also a big national boycott of orange juice at the time, and it had an effect. She was did not have her contract renewed by the Orange Juice Association.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. We're because it takes like courage to stand up and protest for what's right, and then also knowing cameras could be there, right, and are there, and project the images to family and friends elsewhere. I wanted to move a little bit into the 1980s, where in July 1981, the New York Times first reported about AIDS, and then Professor Smith alluded to the June 1986 Supreme Court case about Bowers v. Hardwick that upheld the constitutionality of a Georgia law that criminalized oral and anal sex between consenting adults. And then also in October 1987, she mentioned the National March on Washington that you and John participated in. And at the same time, during this decade in Minnesota, there were many visible LGBTQ folks that served in state and local government. So would you be able to tell us a little bit about your time in the 80s? What were some of the significant events that meant a lot to you during this time?
Well, things had gotten started in Minnesota with the various organizations like Gay House and the Gamma Club and other things like that. And by the 80s, John and I were much more activists, I guess, and we were still pretty much in the closet at work, but we decided to go to the March on Washington. It was a very moving experience. Most of the workers and people had gone home from Washington, and so there were 1 million gays and lesbians in the center of town and staying in all the hotels and on the subways, and it was just a very exciting and strange experience to be in the majority and to have a whole city to yourself, and all the businesses had supportive signs in the windows and were wanting our business and all that sort of thing. I mean, nobody had ever done that before. And you'd go on the subway and the train would be packed, and you'd see your friends from all over the country that you hadn't seen in a long time. And I remember there was one lesbian that stood up in front of our subway car and said, "Is anybody on this train straight?" And everybody sat there, and there were no straight people on this train. It was just a very strange experience. But a lot of things were beginning to move in the 80s, and the 87 March on Washington and the the wedding at the IRS, I have to say that I wasn't too interested in that at the time. My friends wanted us to go to it, and so we went to it. I was kind of cynical about it. I thought, well, this is nothing legal, and you know, it's just kind of another form of protest, and you know, it's not going to have anything romantic about it or anything. But a lot of people took it romantically, especially some of the lesbians, and they were dressed up in white dresses and things like that. And it was a huge crowd, and the Reverend Troy Perry of the Metropolitan Community Church was the conductor of the service. And it was a very interesting experience because it turned out to be very emotional, not just for us and for me, but for the whole crowd. I mean, there were a lot of tears and hugs and kisses, and you know, back then it was still very what should I say, daring to hold hands or kiss your partner in public. And here were all these people doing this, and the TV cameras were rolling, and you know, it was quite an emotional experience.
Yeah, I can only imagine how beautiful and wonderful the experience would be, right? Where people are being themselves in public, and then to have DC be, you know, gay, I think had to be a great experience.
Minnesota had a great delegation, and Wisconsin was the only state that had gay rights law at the time. And they were being led by, in the parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, when we in front of the White House, they were being led by a guy carrying a little statue of a cow hanging from something that looked like a cane, and he was leading their crowd. And our crowd from Minnesota was right behind them, and we had a big banner. And John and I had made signs and at home, and we trucked them all the way to Washington in the little closet that they have on airplanes. Nowadays, they wouldn't let you bring a sign like that on an airplane. But the stewardess was very nice, and she stored them away for us. And so we had these two big signs that said things about stay out of our bedroom and all this sort of thing. And the chant from the Minnesota delegation as we passed the White House, Minnesota had been the only state that didn't vote for Reagan in the previous election. And so we were chanting, "Don't blame us, we said no to Reagan." So that was the Minnesota delegation's contribution.
I love the humor. But then also
there was sadness too in that the parade down Pennsylvania Avenue was led by people with AIDS in wheelchairs, and it was a serious thing. And Sharon, or not Sharon, her partner, was at the march, and she was one of the featured speakers. And so the Minnesota case about that was very much discussed, and she had just published a book about it also.
Right, Sharon.
And there was music and entertainers. There's a videotape of the whole event, which I have. I'll have to give that to the treasure collection. If people don't know, we have a wonderful collection of gay artifacts at the University of Minnesota Anderson Library in the West Bank. And definitely, if you want to do any research on it as historians, that's the place to go. It's one of the only places in the country. I think there's an archive in San Francisco too, but that's pretty much it.
Yes, excellent, Tom. Yes, because the University of Minnesota has wonderful collection, as you mentioned, of LGBTQ history, so many primary sources. And as you mentioned on the parade with individuals with AIDS and in wheelchairs at the beginning of the parade, would you be willing to talk a little bit about what AIDS, like what it was like living through the epidemic?
It was scary. It was every bit as scary as what COVID was in 2020, at least for the gay community. I was working in Edina at the time near France and 494 for an insurance company. And there were a lot of other insurance companies around there. And we had a lunch group, which we called the Edina Ladies Luncheon. And all the gay guys that worked for the insurance companies would gather when they could at a cafeteria in Pentagon Park. And we really got to know each other well and everything. And one day in 1981, there was a little article in the Strib that I was reading at lunch, and it said how doctors had discovered this gay cancer and pneumonia in New York. And when I read that, I'm a little bit of a hypochondriac. And so when I read that, I said, boy, the party is over here. And the 70s had been kind of, in a way, a golden age for gay people in that we were organizing and discovering ourselves, but the rest of the world was still pretty much unaware of us. And so, like when we'd see each other downtown in the skyways and things, we wouldn't shake hands or talk to one another because we didn't want the other people to know. And but we just kind of give a little wave or a wink or something like that. And so well, getting back to the AIDS thing, our Edina Ladies Luncheon was pretty well decimated by AIDS. Basically, they all died starting in 1983. And my closest friend of the group, Steve Baker, died in July of 1986. And it was one of the saddest things that I've ever done. Is to go to the cemetery with his partner and help them pick out a grave for him while he was still in the hospital at Methodist Hospital in St. Louis Park. We had gone to a funeral of another member of the group in 1983, and it was very sad because they had a closed casket and nobody showed up to speak of except the family and a few of us gay people who were his friends. And we sat in the back because the family didn't want anything to do with us. And it had been hard for them to find an undertaker because a lot of doctors and undertakers didn't want to treat gay people at all. So it was a tough time. In the end, I counted up once, and approximately 27 of our friends died of AIDS during the period from 81 to about 96.
Thank you, Tom, for sharing that. We're because I can only imagine how hard that would be to watch my friends die. And it's awful.
And so many people had to go home to their small town and their parents who had rejected them when they were ill and die there. It was a very tough time. But what came out of that was that straight people began to understand us a little better as human beings, and that we had a lot of the same problems that they did. It seems like before AIDS, straight people thought of gays as self-indulgent and not having any responsibilities because they weren't married and didn't have children and things like that. And I think AIDS gave them a different perspective on us.
And as you also mentioned, the difficulties with funerals and partners participating in funerals or having a say with burial and say the passage of assets. Could you then maybe talk about sort of like why marriage is such a pivotal institution and why you and John and others have worked so hard to ensure marriage rights have been opened up, so I was wondering if you could sort of talk to us a bit about you and John's efforts to become married.
Well, being an only child, I was always very concerned because I knew when my parents were gone, I'd be alone in the world. And I had come out to my parents, not really voluntarily. My mother brought it up once when we were alone in the car, and my dad brought it up once when we were driving home from a relative's wedding, and he said, "You and John are more than friends, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, I love him." And my dad, being the the calm person that he was and the understanding person, didn't say any more. So that was very emotional, and the fact that so many people were having problems when they had AIDS and when they were in the hospital and places, and then in later years when some of our friends started dying, even of natural causes. So we had a very good friend named Frank Hirschbach and his partner David Sanford. They were both German professors, Frank at the U and David at McAllister. And when Frank died of cancer, he died in a hospice, they couldn't release his body to David. Frank had been an immigrant from Nazi Germany. He was Jewish. And his brothers and sisters had moved to other countries like Canada and the UK, and the hospice had to call his brother in the UK to get permission before David could have the body. Similarly, we had other friends from St. Mark's Cathedral. Gary Flipson was from St. Cloud, and his parents were very Catholic and had disowned him. And when he died of AIDS, he had a daughter from a previous marriage, and his family went to the hospital and tried to claim the body, but it had already been sent to the crematory, which is what he had wanted. He wanted to be interred in the columbarium at St. Mark's, and they wanted to take him back to St. Cloud and bury him in the family plot in the Catholic cemetery, but he wasn't a Catholic anymore and didn't want that. And the family also tried to convince his daughter, who was a young teenager, to give them the key to the house so they could go in and take whatever they thought had belonged to Gary when Tom was at work. So those are the kind of things that happened and that we saw firsthand, and realized that we really needed marriage because there was no good way to deal with all these issues. And John and I, by this time, were in our late 40s, early 50s, and so it was obvious that we were going to have these problems pretty soon. And so that's pretty much what prompted us to get started in the marriage part of the movement. And the friends of ours that we filed the lawsuit with, there were two other couples, the two lesbians from Duluth, and Doug Benson and Dwayne Bukowski of Robbinsdale. They had grown up in Duluth and gone to the U there, and they had started the Northland Men's Center and were pretty much activists. They went through, like we did, trying to get married in a lot of different places in different countries, like Canada. They got married in Vancouver and California, Massachusetts, and they were all trying to do this sort of thing. And we ended up kind of copying it. But in any event, Doug had a little ad in the Lavender magazine here in the Twin Cities saying he was looking for people to join with the lawsuit. So I answered the ad, and that's how I got involved. And he was a indefatigable lobbyist over at the Capitol for marriage. And so I took on the role of treasurer, like I always have done in the organizations that I've been involved with. I've been involved with a lot of them in the gay community. And so that's how we got started. And in 2008, we formed Marry Me Minnesota, which was a corporation to file this lawsuit. And on May 11th, I believe it was, of 2010, we had a news conference at the Unitarian Society Church near the Walker Arts Center and announced that we had filed the lawsuit in Hennepin County. That in turn triggered a reaction by the Minnesota Family Council and some activists in the Republican Party led by Senator Warren Limmer of Maple Grove. And he got an amendment put on the ballot for 2012 to ban marriage. And these amendments had been having major success in practically every state ever since George W. Bush and his campaign managers had adopted the anti-gay marriage movement as a way to win the election in 2004. And they found that to be a winning issue. And so we started this lawsuit, and a wonderful organizer, another Johnny by the name of Richard Carlbaum, who had been mayor of St. Joe, formed this organization called Minnesotans United for All Families, and they organized the whole campaign throughout the state against the amendment. And the night of November 2nd, I think it was 2012, I was just about paralyzed with fear. I can't tell you how nerve-wracking it is and humiliating to have this society that you're part of vote on the value of your life and your relationship. It's a very humiliating experience. And I was pretty sure we were going to lose. But miracles, we didn't. And that was the night the tide turned nationally. And 3 other states, Maryland, Washington, and Maine, all also voted in favor of marriage. And so it turned into a celebration. And Mr. Carlbaum went on to help lobby the legislature, which had also gone Democratic that night. And we got a Democratic governor with Mark Dayton. And the lobbying then pushed them to pass the gay marriage law, which went into effect the 1st of August. It was signed on the steps of the Capitol in May on a 90-some degree day. People were fainting on the steps of the Capitol because it was so hot, even though it was only May, early May. But then the first weddings were performed at the Minneapolis City Hall at midnight on August 1st. And 2 of our lesbian friends were the first ones that Mayor Rybuck married. And we were witnesses in the city council chamber while a judge married 2 of our close friends. So the whole place was decorated in rainbow lights. And in downtown St. Paul, when the amendment, when it was signed in May, the whole bridge on Wabasha Avenue was lit up, as was the Lowry Bridge in Minneapolis. And we went driving around town like teenagers in St. Paul in John's convertible with the top down, and our 2 close friends, Jerry Flagmark and his partner, Travis Massey, just celebrating and hooting and waving flags and crossing the bridge multiple times. And the chorus was singing at the Osborne Plaza in downtown St. Paul. It was just a wonderful celebration at the time. And what was even a bigger celebration for John, or a bigger surprise for him, was in 2015 when the Supreme Court said that the Pentagon actually celebrated gay rights on the grounds of the Pentagon. John almost fainted of a heart attack, having been in the Air Force in the closet all those years.
And it's a long ways from the don't ask, don't tell under the Clinton administration too.
Right.
Thank you so much, Tom, for sharing sort of that fight for marriage, and then the victory and the feeling of like winning. Where I mean, that has to feel really good after sort of those tense moments in 2012 where the state is voting. So I'm glad it turned out the way it did. And I wanted to circle back to St. John's for a second, because back in the 1980s, you served as treasurer of the Twin Cities St. John's Gay Alumni Group. Would you tell us a little bit more about that group and why it was created and what some of its activities were?
Well, it wasn't very formally organized. At that time, there was a well-known state senator by the name of John Chenoweth, who was a Johnny and had grown up on the east side of St. Paul. And his wife was the Consumer Affairs Commissioner for Governor Rudy Perpich. So they were a very well-known couple. And he was gay and had a house near the Minnetonka Club in Minneapolis. And well, first of all, there had been an ad in we had two newspapers at the time, the Gay and Lesbian Community Voice, run by Tim Campbell, another activist, and the Equal Time newspaper, which was a group effort. And there had been a little ad in there from somebody from St. Thomas saying that they were organizing an alumni group. And of course, we immediately thought, we can't let them do that and not have one for St. John's. So we put our ad in and we gathered this group that way. And John Chenoweth was hospitable enough to open his house for us to have, well, I guess you could just call them kind of cocktail parties these days. But it was a good chance to talk St. John's and what life had been like for us at St. John's as gay people. And, you know, it was just a networking kind of event. So we had several of those. But tragedy struck again, and John Chenoweth was murdered at along the east side of Mississippi, what was called the River Flats, which is a park below the Shriners Hospital. And several years later, my roommate, before I met John in Roseville, who worked for the state, he was also murdered in that same location, and his body was found in the ditch along the parkway in front of the Shriners Hospital. So had been shot by a young man who had been adopted by a professor at Bethel University in Arden Hills, and who was very homophobic. And I guess the young man had a lot of internal homophobia. I found in life that gay people who repress their feelings are frequently the ones that are most homophobic, like Roy Cohen, for instance, back in the 50s, and who sometimes act out in violence like that and beat up other gay people on the streets and things. So anyway, after John died, we were all kind of in shock, and so the group kind of dissipated after that, because it wasn't tightly organized really anyway. So that's pretty much the story of the St. John's Alumni Group. Now, I've been hoping to get the school to say in the St. John's Alumni Magazine and things that there's going to be an affinity group like, I don't know, like the J Club, or I don't know, like the history department, Tegeder-Berg Society, whatever. I mean, I think that it would be good, both for the school and for the gay alumni, if there was an open, organized, official recognition of the group. And I myself have been long wanting there to be a scholarship. So I set one up with Jim Dwyer a couple of years ago, and that's going to get funded when I am called home by the Lord. And I'd love to have more people contribute or set up their own scholarship or whatnot for gay students at St. John's and St. Ben's.
I think that would be a wonderful idea. Tom, where I too agree, where I would love to see an affinity group, not only at St. John's, but also at St. Ben's as well. And the scholarships, where I hope a lot of people will donate now that they know about it. Tom, I think now I've so much enjoyed listening to you and learning from you that I'd like to turn it back over to Brian to see what the audience is thinking and see what questions they have. So Tom, thank you so much for talking with me. It was an honor and a privilege.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to the audience reaction. This is a very strange experience. I've lectured in classrooms, but at least then you can see the students and you can tell if they're bored or happy or what, but you can't tell that here.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for conducting the interview. And again, thank you, Tom, for your stories. As Jonathan said, as historians, these are the primary sources that we so get so excited about, the firsthand accounts and your experience. And you said that you were, wondering about how the audience was, reacting because you can't see them. So the first thing that I'll do is not ask a question, but just read a comment that one participant or one attendee wrote. No question, but just a comment that this is so enlightening. Wow, what a treasure to listen to Tom and hear from someone who has lived through this history. Thank you for hosting. So
I'm glad that he found it useful.
And now we'll move on to a couple of questions. There are a number of questions, and we will get to as many as we can. So one attendee writes, I'm sorry if I missed you talk about this, but could you reiterate what it was like on the U of M campus being a gay student?
Well, at the university, of course, it's a much more anonymous place than St. John's. I'm not sure whether he was mentioning the University of Minnesota or St. John's. Maybe I misread that. Maybe he wants to know about St. John's.
This person actually said University of Minnesota.
Oh, okay. Well, it was a very small group and movement that was centered around an organization that was created by Jack Baker called FREE, which was an acronym for Fight Repression of Erotic Expression. And they were the people that sponsored the dance at Kaufman Union and things like that. And that, were written about in the Minnesota Daily newspaper and that sort of thing. It wasn't really a big movement, and there weren't, marches and pickets and things like that back then. It was too embryonic still at the time. And so, I can't describe many big events or things like that other than this dance that they had. And of course, the firing of Mike McConnell.
Okay, all right, thank you. Another attendee asks, as we move forward, what is something you feel is still missing in today's conversations of marriage equality or concerning social acceptance of the LGBTQ community?
Well, things are so much better than they used to be. It seems like the opponents of the gay movement have focused now on the trans people, and particularly trans youth. And I have to admit that I've been very surprised at how many trans people there are, and particularly how many young people in high school identify as trans and want to express their alternative identity. I have a great deal of sympathy with them because they're kind of in the same place we were, say, back in the 70s. I can't say that I've had their experience, but I will say that I am proud of Minnesota in that when our gay rights law came up in '93, some people in politics wanted to cut out the trans people in order to get more votes in the legislature. And the gay community that was organized at the time, which at that time was mostly made up of men, said no, if the trans people are going to be thrown under the bus, then we don't want the law. And so Minnesota was the first, and I don't know, it may still be the only state that includes trans people in their civil rights law.
All right, thank you. Another person asks, can you talk more about being gay at St. John's and the process of coming out?
Well, you know, St. John's has always been a very open, kind of laid back atmosphere. And it was in the 60s for the most part. There was a little tension over ROTC. Our class was the first one that challenged the requirement of all freshmen and sophomores being enrolled in ROTC and having to pass it. We had lost some students each year who didn't do well in ROTC or didn't want to do well in it in the sophomore year, and so there was some people who left St. John's for that reason. But on the whole, it was a pretty laid-back place, and I think it comes from the rule of St. Benedict, where Benedict tells his monks that they should be tolerant of the foibles and the human weaknesses of their fellow monks. And I think that atmosphere extended to the students and the campus as a whole. There were gay people on campus, of course, but they weren't out. Although if you had gaydar, as most gay people do, you know, you kind of knew who they were, and it was kind of a don't ask, don't tell situation. But on the whole, it was a good place to be, and I was pretty sure that if I had been known to be gay, that I could possibly get expelled, and I wasn't about to take that chance, and I wasn't really sure I was gay yet anyway, and I was so busy studying and wanting to get ahead, you know, with studies and things that again, I was just putting that on the back burner and not really dealing with it.
Could you talk a little bit more about the process of coming out? I mean, you said that you know, you came out to your parents not necessarily in a planned way, but that they had asked you essentially direct questions. How about coming out to other people in your community, to friends and to associates and to coworkers, etc.?
Well, in my case, it wasn't too dramatic. It was more of a slow evolution of. One of the things I've learned is that people, your friends, once they get to know you, they figure it out. And a lot of times they don't say anything because they're afraid of offending you. Or they just don't know what to say. It's like when somebody's sick, you know, you don't know what to say to them necessarily. And you want to be supportive, but you don't want to intrude either. And so it in my case, it kind of just evolved that way over the years. And I'm sure that's with my parents too. You know, my mother, I'm sure, figured it out when I was a little kid long before I did, but didn't want to say anything about it either because she was hoping it would go away. Did I answer that question? Did I get off the track?
No, you hit on it. Yeah, exactly. All right, great. One attendee writes, I teach middle school and have some students who are struggling with or are coming to terms with their sexuality. What is your best advice to the LGBTQ plus youth, or a piece of advice to impart with young LGBTQ plus people with that community?
Well, I have worked with many young people in my life, so I'm certainly no expert on that. But I think the one thing I've learned is that being out and open about who you are is way more healthy for you than trying to keep it hidden. And you'll find that most people will be supportive, and then there'll be a few that will not be. And of course, if they're your parents or your brothers and sisters, that's a big problem for you. But even so, if they know, they have to relate to reality as it is, and you can relate to them about reality as it is. And you get rid of all the secrecy and the innuendo and mistrust, etc. So I would just say for anybody that's of a different persuasion, the thing to do is to be open about it and discuss it frankly.
Thank you. One other person asks, which historical event do you feel has contributed the most or made a huge jump for marriage equality?
Boy, that's hard to say any one. I suspect that the most sympathy among straight people probably came from seeing the problems that not being able to get married does for gay people. I know once we went on a trip, we used to take a file folder of legal documents with us whenever we traveled in case one of us got sick and had to go to a hospital or something. And one time I left that in our driveway as we were leaving. And I had to call our neighbor, and he went over and picked it up. And afterwards, he told me what a horrible situation it was that people like John and I had to drag all these papers around and worry about getting sick on the road and things. So I think that garnered a lot of sympathy from the straight community when they learned about the hassles that we were going through.
One person asks, in your experience, Tom, what is the most effective form of protest?
Oh boy. That's an interesting question because, as was mentioned, there's a definite a rift in the gay community by the assimilationists, which I guess John and I fell into that category, versus the people that wanted to revolutionize the whole society and just abandon all the human history of marriage and gender roles and all that sort of thing. So I really think you kind of need both types of people in order to engender change in a society. Having the really radical people on one end of the spectrum really empowers people like Alan Speer or Richard Karlbaum or people like John and I, because we can say to the politicians, look, we're just asking to get married. These people want a revolutionary. So, give us what we want and take the wind out of their sails, et cetera. So, I think you need both, really.
All right. And this is a question that, Tom, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to answer, but Professor Nash and Professor Smith can jump in this one. So one of the attendees asked, in view of the historical lack of support for the LGBTQ community at St. John St. Ben's, what are the campuses doing now to support LGBTQ students today? Dr. Smith or Dr. Nash, do you know of any activities that are going on campus today? or not today, but in the present?
Well, today actually was a fantastic event called Barbequeer. So the student organization Q Plus was hosting a barbecue in honor of National Coming Out Day. That was held at Multicultural Student Services. And I have loved seeing the signs around campus or on Instagram of the rainbow colored Weber grill that they were using to advertise. But I think we have a really active student organization in particular that is offering a lot of resources and reaching out both to educate allies who maybe just want to learn more about how they can be supportive to their colleagues and classmates, and also provide a lot of resources for students who are figuring things out for themselves or are really seeking to fully live in the ways they want to live. And that can be everything from maps demonstrating where there are unisex bathrooms available on campus, to talking about housing situations, and certainly providing supportive peer groups for each other. Professor Nash, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, we're Shannon, I think to me you said it very well, where it's from my perspective too, is that it's students who are pushing our conversation. And Shannon mentioned there's a new multicultural center that's across from the history department here, and there's a space, the Lavender Union will be a space for the students in Q+. Hopefully it will be a safe space, like brave space on campus. Likewise, our curriculum has changed a little bit in recent years to be more intentional of teaching about sexuality and gender identities within the school's common curriculum, which is now called integrations curriculum. And, you know, despite saying those things, it doesn't mean that St. Ben's or St. John's are perfect places for LGBTQ plus students. But hopefully they're places that are growing and becoming better each day.
Thank you, both Professor Smith and Professor Nash. One person writes, just to continue with this, Q+ is holding multiple events throughout the week and semester to support students, and the Multicultural Center is also available to all. And I think that's a good segue to the end of our program, because I need to thank a few institutions and people for helping us put on this event tonight. As I said, the Tegeder-Berg Society is an association of history students, alums, and faculty, but we could not have done the event tonight without the help of the Multicultural Center. They have been tremendously supportive of this event. And I would also like to thank both alumni and alumni relations for their continued support of the Tegeder-Berg Society and all of the assistance that they have provided for us. And then there is one last comment, and it is, or a question from the audience before we end, and that is, can we meet John? So I think we have to figure out a way after the pandemic for John, for you to come to campus.
Well, we'd love to come to campus, definitely. I would love to be able to meet people in person that way. John wanted to be on this program, but his family is having a little reunion in Indianapolis this weekend, so that's where he is right now. I have one little thing. You know, everybody that goes on a talk show plugs their book, and so I need to plug my 4 novels, which are available on Kindle and at Barnes & Noble Nook. And if people are interested in kind of absorbing some of the atmosphere of these decades we've been talking about, I would recommend them. Let's put it that way.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom, and thank you to everyone who attended tonight's Tegeder-Berg Society events. We hope to see you next semester in the spring, again, when we hope to be back in person. Thank you all, and the event will be recorded, so if you know people who will want to watch it and who could not tonight, it will be available soon. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.